Good afternoon, fellow ruminators. Welcome back to another session, Rumination with Andrew. Thank you so much for joining as we are about to discuss a very important topical matter. And this afternoon, we are going to be looking at why the war in Iran is not Israel's war, it is the US's war, right? So the Iran war was always America's war, right? It has never been Israel's war, but Israel is being used as a proxy state, as Americans like to use proxy states so that they can carry out their nefarious agendas, which is full spectrum dominance. We have been saying this, we have been using this word, and coined by the US industrial complex, the US military industrial complex, and also the book that was written by F. William Engdahl on full spectrum dominance, which we have shared some of those insights with you on this channel. Not sure if you've watched those videos, but you can go back to those videos and watch those videos on US imperialism and full spectrum dominance. Now, please be sure to like the video so that, I don't know if the algorithm is going to like what I'm going to say, but it's very important that you understand this information. So in order to beat the algorithm, let us share the videos, like the videos so that they can be dispersed, they can be disseminated on the platform. Very important that you do that. Now, let us begin with the whole concept that the United States of America is not a republic as it was founded to be. It was founded when it came into being in 1776, when the Declaration of Independence was actually written and pronounced to the then American citizens, that America was now a new state, and it believed in the equality of all men, and that America would not be found waging wars against other nations unnecessarily, as what Europe did, and what the Vatican in its former times during the Middle Ages, during the Dark Ages, did. The United States was an innocent nation that came up, that the Bible described as a two-horned lamb that has two horns, and it was a lamb-like beast, and that the lamb there demonstrates its innocence, almost a symbol, well, it is a symbol of Christ. Cordero, the lamb in the Bible, is a symbol of Christ. So we saw that country coming up, and we know that the country speaks through its laws, and as far as we know, the pronouncements, the sentiments articulated in the Declaration of Independence were innocent laws, and laws that any of us, any nation, would agree with. In fact, it was unprecedented in US history, in the history of humanity, I should say. There has been no other country in the history of humanity which has suggested, except the Israelis, the Jews, when they were a theocracy, under the worship of God, when God was their king. They were the only nations that believed in the equality of all men. In fact, the Israelites had Egyptians who had journeyed with them, rather, from Egypt, and God told them that they should take care of their strangers. So the United States was a country that was founded to house people who were being persecuted and exploited, being oppressed in their countries. They came predominantly from Europe at the beginning of the nation. But no sooner than the nation had come up and had been declared a free nation, than the US started to peddle human lives through slavery. So we know that human beings, on the whole, are hypocrites to a great extent. Without Christ, we are not who we say that we are. Oftentimes, when we say that we are wonderful people, behind the scenes, we are doing some of the most gruesome things that you can think about. Now, let's look at the whole concept of US imperialism. George W. Bush said that America was the new Rome after 9/11. He says that America would occupy the place of the new Rome, of a new Rome. And if we know anything about the Roman Empire, we know that it was a brutal empire. Very brutal empire it was. Now, in a chapter here, Chalmers Johnson, entitled Imperialisms Old and New, he suggested here American leaders now like to compare themselves to the Imperial Romans, even though they do not know how much Roman history. They do not know much Roman history. So the United States is comparing itself to Rome, but they do not know much Roman history. That is a very, very harsh statement. It means that they're dumb. While they're saying that they are like Rome, they don't know much Roman history. And if you look at the typical United States citizen, it is true. Many of them are not aware of geography. They don't know their place in the world. Many US citizens don't even know their own country. They have an understanding that has been given to them, but they don't know the real history behind, the real purpose behind which the United States was created. They don't know, right? And they don't want to know because there's a sense of arrogance that the United States is this great country that is invincible, that is undefeatable, and therefore will remain the same, has gone through many challenges, and will eventually come out the victor. But that is not always the case. And you have to read the history of other empires in which they also had those hubris and those, sentiments of arrogance in which they thought that they would never end. The British said that the sun would never set on its empire. Even today, it still continues to harness that sentiment that the sun will never set on the British Empire. Much like the United States today, the Roman Republic had slowly acquired an empire through military conquest. By the 1st century BC, it dominated all of Gaul, most of Iberia, the coast of North Africa, Greece, the Balkans, and parts of Asia Minor. As the Canadian essayist Manuel Miles observes, there is no historical law prohibiting a republic from possessing an empire. Okay, that's what he suggested. Now, there's something here that I would like to share in terms of how America sees its empire. Now, Chalmers Johnson went on to divide the empire. There are two ideologies behind the empire. Those who think that they are humanitarian, so you have this humanitarian empire. So when they go like the Democrats and they say that they are spreading democracy, when in fact what they're doing, they are destroying democracy. I am not, seeing it here where he categorized the empire into two main ideologies: the right-wing empire and the left-wing empire. So on the right wing, you have the neocons, the ones that produce the project for the new American century, which shall be just elaborating a little bit about in our chat, in our dialogue today about the war on Iran. Now, we must understand that when the Cold War was culminated in 1989 and officially in 1991, now, the fact of the matter is that the United States now was without any rationale for wars. And for those of you who don't know, the United States became an empire in 1947 after World War II. So it's an official empire, well, at that time, it wasn't a full-blown empire. It was rising, okay? Now, the fact is that empires require war because that is how they sustain, that is how an empire sustains itself. Why I think the United States perhaps is the most dangerous empire in world history is that, and people can correct me, is that it's a corporate empire in which it has massive corporations behind its backing. So you will see that these empires are getting millions through private contractors, whether, weapons contractors and other forms of contractors, people who render services, to the military-industrial complex. They make millions, if not billions of dollars from these wars. But the monies that are generated are not for the public, for the sustenance of the public economy. It is for the sustenance of the elites, for the ruling elites and their bona fide friends, their buddies in the system. Now, there are people who will say to me, wow, we're not going to win that war. Americans are not going to win that war. The United States as an empire is not in the game to win war. It's in the game to control the world and to achieve full spectrum dominance. So when you're hearing that it is not logical or it is not rational what Trump is doing or what Biden, has done or did, or Obama or any of these presidents that went abroad and instigated wars, yes, it is logical from their perspective because they're making millions and billions. Because war is profitable. It is a scam. And we have to now dig beneath the rubbish of the scam and see and unearth what we need to unearth to educate ourselves and to make ourselves informed. Now, there was an article here that was written by, I think they call it let me see the website here, International Socialist Review. The establishment of the State of Israel, this author is suggesting, coincided with the rise of the Middle East as an oil producer and with the displacement of Britain by the US as the main imperialist power in the region. So the United States actually replaced Britain. Until the Second World War, imperialist strategists considered the Middle East primarily as a passageway to trade in the Far East. But in the 1930s and 1940s, according to a US oil industry report prepared in that period, the center of gravity of world oil production is shifting from the Mexican Gulf and the Caribbean areas to the Middle East, Persian Gulf area, and is likely to continue to shift until it is firmly established in that area. So now we're seeing where oil is a very important ingredient post-1930s, 1940s, and post-World War II. The US wasn't the only power to recognize the Middle East's importance in the aftermath of World War II. So did the other major superpower, the USSR. In 1947, the USSR voted with the US to approve the partition of Palestine in the United Nations. Later, in 1948, a shipment of Soviet bloc arms from Czechoslovakia to the Zionist Haganah militia aided Israel's conquest of Palestine. Okay? In the geopolitics of the time, the US and Russia competed to win allies in the Third World to their side. Both the Russians and the US consider the loss of an ally an autocratic gain for the other side. Although it seems absurd today, some US Zionists argued for US support on grounds that failure to aid Israel would drive the Jewish state to seek support from the USSR. The United States is going to have to grant sufficient financial support to the present Israeli regime to avoid seeing the country go bust and perhaps swing into communist hands, wrote New York Times, Cyrus L. Sullenberger in 1948. Now listen to how these guys have divided up the world and for their own conquest. When the moderate Iranian prime minister, let me make this thing bigger because it's very fine. The print is very fine and I'm barely seeing what's happening here. All right, so when the moderate Iranian prime minister Mossadegh, that's Mohammad Mossadegh, announced his intention to nationalize Anglo-Iranian oil properties in 1952, the West responded with frenzied denunciations of the prime minister as a communist. So anytime you want to secure any of your industries or resources for the benefit of your own citizens, the United States is going to call you a communist in that time during the Cold War, but now it could call you a terrorist, which means that you are a threat to global security and global peace. That is how they frame the narrative. Very important that you understand this. Okay? So the CIA overthrew Mossadegh in 1953, installing the pro-US Reza Pahlavi as Shah of Iran. During the Mossadegh crisis, the moderate Israeli paper Haaretz made an offer to the West. Now listen to the offer that the major or the moderate Israeli newspaper, as he's suggesting here. The West is none too happy about its relations with states in the Middle East. The feudal regimes there have to make such concessions to the nationalist movements that they become more and more reluctant to supply Britain and the United States with their natural resources and military bases. So the United States wants military bases, and they also want oil within the region. So when we say just oil, it also has to do with military bases. Because when the United States has military bases in the region, then the United States is going to control the world, right? Or control that region. The United States' goal is to control the entire world, including that region of the Middle East. Now, it's a very difficult region to control because the Muslims are just that they're going to fight until death. Okay? The Muslims are going to fight until death. They're not scared to fight, right? But the United States, when they cannot fight them, with stones and with, rocks, will fight them with nuclear weapons. Very important that you understand that. Therefore, strengthening Israel helps the Western powers maintain equilibrium and stability in the Middle East. Strengthening Israel helps the Western powers maintain equilibrium and stability in the Middle East. Israel is to become the watchdog. Listen to what they're saying, and this is a moderate newspaper out of Israel. Israel is to become the watchdog. There is no fear that Israel will undertake any aggressive policy towards the Arab states when this would explicitly contradict the wishes of the United States and Britain. But if for any reason the Western powers should sometimes prefer to close their eyes, Israel could be relied upon to punish one or several neighboring states whose discourtesy to the West went beyond the bounds of the permissible. So Israel is there to protect the interest of the United States and its Western allies. That is why the state of Israel was created. Okay, so when you think that this is Israel's war, they are just proxies being used to wage a war by the United States and its Western allies, but predominantly the United States, because the United States wants full spectrum dominance, and it doesn't even want its allies to be having any power. It doesn't want any partnership in any of its power. Okay? Very important that you understand that. US strategic doctrine relied on building a network of pro-Western states to hem in any Arab regime which bucked the West. I repeat that. US strategic doctrine relied on building a network of pro-Western states to hem in any Arab regime which bucked the West. Over the years, the US relied on combinations of Turkey, the Shah's Iran, Israel, and the Gulf monarchies to forge this alliance. But Israel became the first among these only after its quick victory in its 1967 war. Following months of provocations against its Arab neighbors, Israel stuck in June 1967, having planned the war with an eye to throttling Nazarism and conquering what parts of Palestine it hadn't seized in 1948. In 6 days, Israel crippled the Egyptian, Syrian, and Jordanian military forces. It seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan, and the Gaza Strip and Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Nothing proved Israel's value to the US better than its blizzard through the Arab states. The US was even willing to forgive and forget Israel's attack on a US surveillance ship, the Liberty, anchored off the Sinai coast. Israeli planes bombed the Liberty and naval vessels torpedoed it. 34 US sailors died in the attack. So even if once the US agenda is being fulfilled and being achieved, they don't care if even some of their officials, their soldiers die. They don't care about the collateral damage, as we're seeing here. All right? The payoff from the US to Israel was immediate. Between 1967 and 1972, total US aid to Israel jumped from 6.4 billion per year to 9.2 billion per year. And this was in 1967 to 1972. The US was already giving Israel billions of dollars. For what? US loans for Israeli purchases of US-made weapons jumped an average of 22 million US dollars annually in the 1960s to a yearly leverage of 445 million US dollars between 1970 and 1974. So from 22 million to 445 million dollars between 1970 and 1974. The US Congress even allowed the Pentagon to hand weapons to Israel without expecting any payment. The US Congress even allowed the Pentagon to hand weapons to Israel without expecting any payment. House Speaker John McCormack noted in 1971 that Great Britain, at the height of its struggle with Hitler, never received such a blank check in US military aid. Israel had finally gained its desired status as strategic asset to the United States. What did I say? Israel finally gained its desired status as strategic asset to the United States. So Israel is a strategic asset to the United States military-industrial complex. So it is and strategic asset in the Middle East, as he's here saying, in the Middle East. Okay? Democratic Senator Henry Jackson, nicknamed the senator from Boeing for his hawkish views, pronounced in May 1973 that the strength and Western orientation of Israel on the Mediterranean and Iran on the Persian Gulf safeguards the US's access to oil. So if Israel is not there, and we know that Biden said in a speech, I think it was in 2021 or 22 in Congress, that if there was not an Israel, Americans would have to create one. So if there was no Israel in the Middle East, the United States would have to create one to be used as her strategic asset so that they can topple all of these nationalist Muslim states. We have to understand that. So when we say that this is Israel war, Israel is participating, of course, and I'm sure that they have their economic and military and political interests. But the major interest in the region, if the United States was not providing this large amount of money and arms to Israel and intelligence to Israel, the war would have to stop. The war would stop immediately. Because one, they wouldn't have the weapons to fight the war against Iran or against any other Middle Eastern nation. Secondly, they wouldn't have the intelligence. When you're fighting wars, intelligence is primordial, right? Is of paramount importance. Have to have intelligence. And the same thing that is happening also in the Ukraine. If the United States had deceased, or desisted, I should say, not deceased, but desisted, if the United States had desisted from arming the Ukraine, then, and also providing intelligence, then the war against Russia would also terminate. But the United States is not doing that because the United States also has interest. It wants Russia to die. It wants Russia to be weakened and not to have the level of influence that it has in that neck of the woods. Listen to what this is saying now, as the guy puts it here in his article. Israel's role as regional enforcer for the U.S. fit the Nixon administration's post-Vietnam policy of subtracting U.S. foreign policy to local client states. Wow. This is really some heavy stuff. This is deep. I'm going to repeat it because perhaps I did not pronounce my words as explicitly and clearly as I should have. Israel's role as regional enforcer for the U.S. fit the Nixon administration's post-Vietnam policy of subtracting or subcontracting U.S. foreign policy to local client states. So the United States is a military state because that's what they're doing. They're not using diplomacy to engage nations anymore. And this has been happening from when? From 1947. But we see now here that even Nixon in the 1970s used this sort of approach. And when I listen to the media, to the US media, even from independent, so-called independent media in the US, you think that Israel, the Israel lobby group, is the group that controls the US. That is the front. That is the face. That's what they would like us to see. But behind the scenes, the Pentagon, the US military-industrial complex controls AIPAC. But the United States doesn't want its dirty job to be seen until it's seen. And oftentimes it's seen, when it is seen, it is too late. And American citizens are going to, wow, and it's too late to control the beast. It is going to be too late. It's already too late to control the beast. But Americans will never wake up. This is war on Iraq 2.0, as I'm seeing some people are suggesting. That's not my invention, by the way. Many people are suggesting that this is war on Iraq, Iraq War 2.0, and they're correct. Nixon and his errand boy, National Security Advisor, and later Secretary of State Henry Kissinger assembled a strategic triangle of Saudi Arabia, the Shah's Iran, and Israel to guard U.S. interests in the Middle East. Let me repeat that, okay? Because we think that this is all about Trump and what Trump is doing. And by the way, I think that Trump must have had some negotiation with the military-industrial complex. Maybe they were going to topple him as they did to Epstein, their guy. You know, when they were having him with all these court cases and all of these allegations against Trump. Okay, and perhaps they were going to imprison him because they're all guilty. Many of these people are guilty, have done some of the most heinous crimes that you can think about, that you can imagine. So maybe his quest was, well, let me go back and I will deal with Iran. Because in his first term, he was hesitant. He was diffident in terms of attacking Iran. And that was something on the agenda, by the way, because the National Security Advisor, John Bolton, who is a neocon, wanted to attack Iran even then. And I'm sure that's one of the reasons why Trump didn't want him in the administration. He also wanted to attack Venezuela. And Trump told him no. Okay? So Trump has now come back a much more confident person in his war maneuverings. Not that he is running the show, but he is willing to sign off on these deals. Okay? Hope you're understanding. So from the days of Nixon, we are seeing here that there's a triangle, a strategic triangle of Saudi Arabia, the Shah's Iran, and Israel to guard US interests in the Middle East. But remember now that the Shah's Iran was toppled in 1979. Was it 1979? I think, right? So when that regime, the Shah's regime, was toppled because the Shah regime actually replaced Mossadegh, who wanted to nationalize the oil industry, and the United States removed him unceremoniously from his position. And I won't tell you, I read in the book, The Devil's Chess Game, and I forgot the name of the author. And he wrote in a very, he painted this very vivid picture, I should say, but hideous picture, vivid yet, vivid, but yet hideous picture of the way in which Mossadegh was treated. Even though he was willing and had submitted to US dominion and authority, and they had removed him from his position as the prime minister, president, whatever they call them, of Iran. But when they dethroned him, they humiliated him by having him take off his clothes. I think somewhere in the, was it the airport or some public place, just to see if he had had any weapons or anything in his clothes. Right? They humiliated the president of the country. Now, the Iranians have this history. They know this history better than I do. Right? So they are there to fight. So the US, this triangular strategic interest between Saudi Arabia, or among Saudi Arabia, Shah's Iran, which was toppled in 1979, and Israel. So now the United States, if it is going to control the Middle East, needs Iran. And that is why we're seeing this war being waged against Iran. Okay? Now, if you read the project for the New American Century, which was online from 2000 to, after even 9/11, up to 2009, I understand, when they removed it. But they have it under a new name. Because that is what they do. When you find what they're doing, and they don't want to be exposed, then they will put their document and they change it into a more euphemistic, a more palatable, a more humanitarian form of doctrine. But it is still diabolical in every sense of the word. Very important that you understand that. So you see the triangular interest there. And that is why people are saying, they'll say to you, oh, if the United States attack Iran, Saudi Arabia, because it's also a Muslim state, is going to fight against the United States. But they have strategic interests. And notice that Trump was in Saudi Arabia recently. And while Trump was behaving as if he, on one side, was trying to negotiate with Iran, it now seems that on the other end, he was propping up Israel to launch an attack on Iran. Now, this is how empires behave. This is how empires behave. And there's no logic. There is no rationale behind how they behave. And many of us were looking at the United States from that very narrow lens. It is a democracy, and why are they doing this? We're going to lose the war. Who's going to lose the war? American citizens, yes, stand to lose because they are going to be attacked. For sure. The economy is going to go haywire. That's for sure. Okay? So the United States citizens are going to lose. But the military contractors, the arms dealers, the people who engineer and these think tanks, they are not losing. They are gaining. There are people in this world, let me say that to you. It sounds very creepy, but there are people in this world who like wars. And they benefit, they laugh, it's their joy. And if they could, if God had allowed them to, they would wage wars per day and to kill people. There are people, when they see other people die, they love it. Remember now that Hillary Clinton, when she was Secretary of State, after she had, masterminded the plot that was successful to have killed um, Gaddafi. She said that we came, we saw, and I think she might have said we killed. Right? I think she used that word, but you can actually correct me. But she was happy. And after Gaddafi's death, we saw where the country plunged into a civil war and there was utter chaos. Now, when you think that the chaos is a sign of defeat of the US military-industrial complex, it is not. They love chaos because it's only through chaos that the military-industrial complex thrives. The US and any military-industrial complex thrives on chaos. And that is what you have to understand. So when you think Trump is chaotic and he's doing this and he's saying that and he's not very sure what he's saying, it is strategic. It is strategic. He might have some suffering from some mental derangement syndrome. Maybe he is, but it is strategic. And these are the people that the Pentagon likes to run the show. Okay? Because that is what the system is about. Hubris, arrogance, right? And having no shame and being cold in your human spirit. Okay? Very important that you understand that. I hope I'm clear as I possibly can be. Okay? I hope that. So Israel took its newfound US responsibilities with gusto. When King Hussein moved to crush Palestinian guerrillas in Jordan in September 1970, Syrian tanks invaded Jordan. Right? So all of these things we see where the United States military-industrial complex is using these strategic countries to wage war on the Middle East and to control the Middle East. But when you read the newspapers, particularly the liberal newspapers from the West or of the West, you're not getting that impression. When you read the New York Times, when you read the Guardian newspaper, the US Today, all of them, the politicos, they do not give you a true understanding of what is happening. They pretend as if this is a Trump war. And this is being waged because Trump is a maniac. That is how they frame the story. But they will not tell you that this has a history and that the United States military-industrial complex, through the writing of the Project for the New American Century, right, that these plans were already brewing and on the agenda decades ago. Decades ago. But they will not say that. Why couldn't we hear a story coming from the New York Times as the article that I read you from the International Socialist Review? Right? Why couldn't the New York Times or the editorial coming from The Guardian give you that sort of historical understanding? Now look at what The Guardian is saying in an editorial piece. The Guardian view on Netanyahu's Iran war, long planned, recklessly pursued, and perilous for all. But the fact that they're suggesting here that this is Netanyahu's war is not. It's a lie. Listen to what the editorial from The Guardian says, from the UK Guardian. In late 2020, General Mark Milley, then chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, urged Donald Trump not to attack Iran and to ignore pressure from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, who was pushing hard for military action. Mr. Trump backed down after the general warned that attacking Iran would start a war with the risk of US officials being tried as war criminals in The Hague. Okay? 5 years on, Israel's prime minister has a fight with Tehran, that he has spent decades preparing for, bolstered by Mr. Trump's claims that international law no longer applies. And it was not Mr. Trump's laws that international laws no longer apply. It is George W. Bush's. He was the one who says that the United States is a new Rome and that they're not obligated to respecting international law. In fact, many legal experts in the United States during the Bush's administration, that's the Bush son, George W. Bush, they wrote extensively about the abuse of international law, or the abuses of international law during the Bush's reign, right? But while the New York Times and these left-wing so-called liberal media houses, they excoriate what is happening, they often do not give you, one, the true perspective of the historical understanding of what is happening, and the United States is culpable. The only time they do it is when Republicans are in office. They pretend as if they want to save democracy, okay, when they are behind it. They're framing because the fact that they're lying to you and giving you propaganda suggests that they are in support of the US imperial ambitions. Okay, so this is what they're framing it as, that it's a Netanyahu's war. It's a war that he has waged. As I'm suggesting to you, from a superficial perspective, that is what we're seeing. But we have to have a historical and a global perspective to understand that that is not so. That this war was already planned and in the works decades ago, and is now just being implemented. And that Trump, in his first term, the Pentagon was already forcing him to enter into a war with Iran. And for that reason, he went and he killed the general, their primary general, just before he demitted office in 2021. Okay, that was a provocation. And we all thought that that was going to be the impetus for war when that general was actually killed. But then, of course, we had the whole January 6th, and all of that came, and the distractions, that didn't happen. And Biden came in, and COVID, he had to deal with COVID. And also he had to deal with what was happening with waging a war, because his task was to wage a war with Russia. But Ukraine was being used as the proxy through which the war with Russia is being waged. And the same thing is happening with Israel. Israel is being used as a proxy state for US to launch its war against Iran, because Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Israel are the three triangular strategic states through which the United States is going to cement its full spectrum dominance in the Middle East. Must understand, and I hope that you are seeing the picture and you will do further research on that. Now, in an article written by Responsible Statescraft, and this was written on April 13, 2020, and it's titled An Appreciation Chalmers Johnson's Writings on American Empire. The Blowback series, comprising 3 volumes, remains a prime source for understanding the motives of American foreign policy in the Trump era and merits a retrospective appreciation. And I would correct this off by saying not only in the Trump administration, but he was talking in the Trump era. This was the Trump era because this was published in April on April 13, 2020. Okay, so this is an article that was published during Trump's first administration. So that's why I think he's contextualizing it. But it's a lesson for all administrations. Okay? But let us look at what Richard Drake is saying in his article. Very important article. It has been nearly 10 years since Chalmers Johnson, where he's now writing in 2020, died. Chalmers Johnson died in 2010. And twice that long since the publication of Blowback, The Costs and Consequences of American Empire. All the books I've read that Chalmers Johnson has written. That Johnson's condemnation of American imperialism originated in a conservative political and philosophical tradition makes him a somewhat unusual figure because he was conservative, but he understood that, one can be conservative or one can be liberal, but you should be able to change, as he always says. Chalmers was always saying, once you give me the evidence, then I'll change my behavior. I'll change my response. And as he read, as he was exposed to more information, he altered his behavior. And we should be willing to do that as Chalmers did, because we're humans, and to err is to be human. Such viewpoints more characteristically come from the left than the right. So what Chalmers Johnson and the books that he has written is more progressive than what we see coming from the liberal Democrats, because they are hawks, just like the Republicans. They're war hawks. The Blowback series, eventually comprising 3 volumes, remains a prime source for understanding the motives of American foreign policy in the Trump era and merits a retrospective appreciation. Listen to what the article is saying. Only after the end of the Cold War did Johnson begin to question the assumptions of the American foreign policy he had served in and out of uniform. So Johnson was a part of that. He used to work for the CIA. Chalmers Johnson used to work for the CIA. So if anybody knows anything about the CIA and their documents, and he was a voracious reader, you can see it in the way how he spoke, how eloquent the man, how he writes. One of America's best authors of all times. And when you think about history, these people were like walking historical encyclopedias, right? And I make no exaggerated statement. I make no exaggerated statement about Chalmers Johnson. He was a true intellectual. Intellectuals were not, America is no longer producing. He had understood the need for a far-flung American military presence to oppose the murderous tyranny of the Soviet Union. Why, even after the Soviet Union had disappeared, however, did the United States continue to maintain an ever-increasing network of military bases? In Blowback, he set out to find answers to this question. And that is what he said. He had thought that the United States foreign policy during the Cold War, in which he sometimes worked for the CIA and the military-industrial complex, he used to support what the United States was doing, saying that the United States wishes to fight against communism because he thought communism, which it is a totalitarian system of government. But after the Cold War, when he thought now the United States had won the war and communism had, in the old world, had died, he thought it was now time for the United States to settle down and to have a time of peace and to encourage a decade of peace. Instead of doing that, however, he realized that the United States was actually plotting wars. And that was the time, I think was in 1992, that they started to write the project for the new American century, preparing for war. preparing the United States for non-ending wars in the 21st century. Huh? Johnson began with a confession, although abysmally ignorant about the dysfunction and oppression in communist societies. The Berkeley radicals had understood the nature of American capitalism better than he did. American foreign policy did make sense only in the light of economics. American foreign policy did make sense only in the light of economics. During the Second World War, the United States had taken the lead in creating the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank as the financial means of creating a global capitalist order. To defend that order, an American empire of military bases would ring the globe. So it's interesting to note, and I think that I have not done that study, but based on what I've read so far, I would think in every country in which you have IMF agreements and in which the IMF operates and the World Bank, you have US military bases, okay, in every country. My understanding is that you have military bases even in Jamaica, and the IMF is there, and many other countries in Argentina, and the IMF is there in Brazil. Okay, so I think that all these countries, the IMF plays an important role in cementing US military ambitions. Very important that you understand them, okay? So everything everywhere would be a concern of the United States in its self-appointed role as the guardian of the status quo. The Soviet Union had been a more pretext than a reason for these worldwide operations, as the continued existence of an American empire of bases after the Cold War made manifest. Okay? Listen to what the article continues to say. Ironically, Johnson's economic interpretation of American foreign policy resembled in some key respects the radical political views he always had opposed. Unlike the Berkeley radicals touting Herbert Marcuse and Frantz Fanon, however, Johnson looked to the country's oldest traditions for inspiration. He found in George Washington's farewell address a summa of responsible statescraft. Okay? This, it's interesting to see how ignorant our people are, despite the fact that we should be more enlightened. All right? That we should be more enlightened in our generation. Right? It's interesting that people choose to be ignorant. People choose to be ignorant. But, if you want to be ignorant, you have to understand that you're going to have to pay the consequences. You will have to pay the blowback. Or the consequences, you will have to suffer the consequences of blowback. A sequel, Blowback attracted little notice at the time of its publication the year before 9/11. As Johnson later observed, it was dismissed as the compilation of the oddball thoughts of a formerly eminent Japan specialist. It took the destruction of the World Trade Organization or Center for the book to become a bestseller and achieve a large readership across a broad spectrum of political opinion, left to right. Okay? So we're seeing here where the United States and its foreign policy is devoted towards military conquest and on ending military wars. Listen to what this writer is saying here in the Responsible Statecraft. American foreign policy, Johnson argued, did not flow as a natural tributary from the mainstream of a Republican culture promoting the common good of the people. Instead, the United States interacted with the rest of the world mainly according to the wishes of the dominant lobbies working for the military-industrial complex. Wall Street, oil, and Israel, the chief architects. So Wall Street, oil, and Israel are chief architects of the military-industrial complex. I repeat that. Wall Street, oil, and Israel are the chief architects, however you want to pronounce that word, of the U.S. military-industrial complex. But let me say what the author says here. Wall Street, oil, and Israel, the chief architects, promoters, and beneficiaries of the American empire. These are the beneficiaries of the American empire: Wall Street, oil, and Israel. These groups bore a heavy responsibility for our sorrows of empire. And look at the sorrows of empire that the United States is facing: perpetual war, terrorism, the loss of democracy, disinformation, militarism, and insolvency. Do you know what the word insolvency means? It means lack of money. Okay? The United States of America is broke because it has allowed itself to be engaged in these perpetual wars, which is one of the sorrows of empire. Let me repeat again the sorrows of the empire: perpetual war, terrorism, the loss of democracy, disinformation, which they tell you what you want to hear and they do not inform you of the truth. They tell you that we are going to war because we're there to protect you. Militarism and insolvency. Okay? Now, Chalmers Johnson will explain to you that militarism does not mean that you should, a military. It's not the same. It doesn't have the same meaning. It's important for the United States to have a military to defend its shores, right? However, when militarism means that you see war as a way of brokering peace or fostering diplomatic relations, if that is able to do that, it can't do that. But instead of engaging people diplomatically, you wage a war against them so you can bully them, right? And that is what the United States is doing, right? The third book in Johnson's trilogy, Nemesis, The Last Days of the American Republic, appeared in 2006. The classical past provided a comparative framework for his critique of the American empire. Reading Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, remember that Bush said that the United States is the new empire, is the new Rome, I should say, that the United States is the new Rome, he saw a parallel between ancient Rome and the United States, where republics had given way to militarized empires. So the Roman was first, the Roman Empire was first a Roman republic. It was a republic that morphed into an empire, and then it died. Rome's imperial system had ended in bankruptcy, defeat, and dissolution. The United States would end the same way. Our national delusions about American exceptionalism notwithstanding, it took 500 years for the Roman Empire to fall. And I'm going to say it took 500 years for the Roman Empire to fall. When people say that the United States empire is about to fall, that is not true. It is the US's republic and democratic processes and institutions that are about to die. The United States empire will last until Christ returns. For those of you who know your prophecy, you know, and if you're following history, if you're following politics, you will see that the United States has what? The greatest empire in the history of humanity. One of the most formidable empires. Okay? That's building. And it's not only controlling things on Earth here, but it's also controlling things in outer space. This is how massive an empire the US has built, but it has made the United States into an insolvent state. Now, when a state becomes insolvent, then you can impose dictatorship on the people because they have no rights. They can't stand up for their rights because they are dependent upon you to feed them. The United States is now being transformed into a paternalistic state, just like any communist nation, where you have to depend on Big Brother to even feed you and to shelter you and to inform you. You're not intelligent enough. You can't decide for yourself what is true or what is false. In other words, the United States is now morphing into a theocracy. And that is what, and this is something that is dangerous, because Trump now is going to use, and other people, the Christian religion as the buffer now to sell the US empire to its citizens and the world, saying, we're here to promote goodness and discipline and moral upstanding values. Okay? Because we all know the Democrats destroyed completely the moral fabric of the United States. And now we have at the other end of the pendulum, the United States is going to come up now and say, we want to restore Christianity and moral decency and sane values. We want to bring these things back to the United States. We want to go to the days of our founding. And that is not true that the United States founding was based on a Christian nation. It was built on Protestant ideologies, and Protestantism, I think it is, yeah, Protestantism, that's what the word is for. Protestantism, okay, is built on the freedom, or the separation, I should say, of church and state, that there should not be any merger of church and state. And that is what US citizens should understand. Okay? So this is what this is where the United States is going. It is not that this is Israel's war. This is the US military-industrial complex's war. And as we suggested, back in the days from the 1970s and prior, the United States wanted to have 3 states in the Middle East which would do its bidding, so that it can control the entire Middle East: Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Iran. The US still has Saudi Arabia in its radar, under its radar, and Israel, but it doesn't have Iran. And now it's going after Iran, so that after Iran, and they've already toppled the Syrian government, Yemen, Iraq is already under US command. So Iran has to be under US's command. Now, people are suggesting that the US is not going to win, but the United States is not in there to win. Once the United States gets and have regime change, that is what it's there for, to have regime change. Then it doesn't matter what happens in the country afterwards. Because once they change the government into a government that is more Western in ideology and is aligned with US and Western philosophies and ideologies, then that would have been their conquest. So when you're thinking that the wars are being waged just to win and you know, you're going to see that the United States goes there now and occupy and build the nation and for the people, and you're going to see democracy. Well, that's what it says it's about to do, but that is not what it's there to do. And we have seen many of these wars in history that is not what the United States is there to do. The United States wants to control the natural resources, control the government, so that they can have perpetual control of these countries. If that happens, and when it happens, the US has won the war. Not the people, but the military leaders, the contractors, the arms dealers. Do you understand that? So don't go around saying that the United States is going to win the war. Yeah, there are going to be some casualties. There's going to be definitely some setbacks for these military leaders too. And sometimes their plans are pushed back. Just if you read the project for the New American Center, which I read years ago, Iran should have been long attacked. Okay, but the war in Iraq progressed longer than these military leaders had thought. It doesn't mean, therefore, that they have not gotten what they wanted. They got what they wanted. Of course, they've left a chaotic nation, a nation that is totally ravaged and in decline and destroyed. However, if you understand what militarism is about, then you would know that at the end of the day, despite human suffering, the arms dealers, the US military-industrial complex, the Pentagon, they would have won, not in the sense of how you and I, as citizens, as civilians, would perceive a win, a victory. They don't perceive victories in the way we do. And you have to also think in that same vein when you look at what is happening with the trade wars. Trump's win, Biden's win, economic win is not your economic win. It is the financial elites, the warmongers' victory. I hope I'm clear. So we know that the United States is there for economic purposes and wants to control Iran. Military purposes, it wants to control the Middle East, the entire Middle East, and it's using Israel as a proxy state, and also Saudi Arabia, and will eventually use Iran to achieve full spectrum dominance in that region. You can't tell me that the United States is not nearing its agenda. It is almost close to achieving its full spectrum dominance in the Middle East. Syrian government has been toppled, as I suggested. Iraqi government toppled years ago. All right? And all of these other countries in the Middle East have been devastated, and the United States has put in its officials, its politicians, whom it wants to run the show on its behalf. Right? So stop listening to these podcasts when they're telling you that yes, are there not going to be challenges? There are going to be challenges. Are there not going to be casualties? Yes, and they don't care, because another of the agenda is to also reduce the human population. So they are using one stone to kill two birds. Okay? So making money while the population is being reduced. Isn't it sad? Where has our humanity gone? Where is it? Can we even say that we're humans anymore? Have we lost our human touch, or human connection? Perhaps more importantly, have we lost our spiritual connection with God? Because that's what it's all about. We have no soul, we have no body, we have no heart, I should say. We have a body, but we don't have any heart. And these leaders, and many of us are guilty as civilians because we do not want to educate ourselves. We don't, because if you're not educated, it means therefore that you're on board with lots of what your leaders are doing. Because if you don't know what they're doing, then how can you understand, right? How can you understand the decisions that they're making, that sometimes you go and you vote for the same people who are wreaking havoc around the world, right? You vote for them. You vote for them. You gladly vote for them. You don't care, right? You don't care. You just want to ensure that I'm enjoying life while people are being unalived around the world. How can you think that way? How can you not educate yourself? How can you not read a book that Chalmers Johnson has produced for posterity, for us to understand the system? And sometimes when you talk and you say dictatorship is here in the Western Hemisphere, people are just like, what are you talking about? I'm voting, I'm driving on the streets, and nobody's troubling me. I'm free. But if you look carefully at the system, and if you look behind the scenes to see who is sponsoring our politicians and what policies, in spite of what they tell you in Congress, they are implementing and they're crafting, you are going to understand that you're not free. You will understand that you're not free, that you are a slave on the plantation. And as the US becomes more militarized, it is going to lead into a full-blown dictatorship. And the Bible is correct that the entire world, it is going to, this nation, the United States, this lamb-like beast, this what was known to have been, what started out as a lamb-like beast, is going to rapidly morph into a dragon. And for those of you who don't read your Bible, the dragon symbolized in the Bible, the dragon is a symbol of the devil himself. In other words, the United States moved from the appearance of being like Christ, of having a Christ-like disposition and appearance, to having a diabolic disposition that is going to cause the entire world to wander after the Roman beast. Right? How could that be? How could that be? But if you are devoted to reading the prophetic history of the United States, then you'll see what is happening. If you read also the secular history, it's the same thing. In fact, the secular history solidifies what the biblical history has suggested. We have passed through a medical emergency 5 years ago, and people still have not yet woken up. They still have not yet woken up to see that we will never go back to where you thought you were before 2020. We're moving fast, right? The train is now moving at full speed to the state of authoritarianism. Are you ready? Are you ready? Let me know. Thank you so much for joining. I hope that you'd like, share, and subscribe. Remember, like the videos and leave a thoughtful comment to let me know what you think about the war on Iran and how you think that this might affect you. And also leave a topic that you would want me to talk about as regards the war with Iran. You can also leave questions, and I will try as best as possible to answer your questions. See you in another video. All the best. Hasta luego. Ciao.